What happens when Hollywood's most controversial redemption story meets late-night television's sharpest tongue? You won't believe what unfolds when Mark Wahlberg sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a lighthearted promotional appearance that spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night history. Within minutes of cameras rolling, what started as typical celebrity banter transformed into a verbal battlefield that left studio audiences gasping and production assistants scrambling. By the time the dust settled, one A-list actor would storm off set, leaving behind a trail of accusations, uncomfortable truths, and a host who had completely lost his composure on live television. The tension was palpable from the moment Wahlberg settled into the guest chair, his trademark Boston swagger immediately clashing with Colbert's calculated smugness. The Late Show host, known for his ability to disarm guests with seemingly innocent questions that carry hidden barbs, appeared unusually aggressive from the opening moments. Something about Wahlberg's presence seemed to trigger an almost visceral reaction in Colbert, who abandoned his usual theatrical charm in favor of barely concealed hostility. "Mark Wahlberg, everybody," Colbert announced with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his voice dripping with a kind of false enthusiasm that immediately put the audience on edge. "The man who somehow convinced Hollywood that beating up random Asian men as a teenager qualifies you for leading man status." The studio fell silent. This wasn't the gentle ribbing that late-night audiences expected. This was a direct assault. Wahlberg's jaw tightened visibly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as he processed what had just happened. The actor, no stranger to confrontation, leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the edge that had made him famous in films like The Departed. "Excuse me?" Wahlberg's Boston accent became more pronounced, a sure sign that his temper was beginning to flare. "What did you just say to me?" Colbert, seemingly emboldened by his guest's reaction, doubled down with the kind of reckless abandon that would define the rest of the interview. "Oh, come on, Mark. We're all friends here. I'm just saying, most actors have to go to acting school or wait tables. You took the more direct route to stardom." The host's smirk widened as he delivered the line, clearly pleased with his own cleverness. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something far different from typical late-night television. Wahlberg's publicist, visible in the wings, was frantically making cutting motions across her throat, trying to signal to the production team that this interview needed to be steered back on track immediately. "Listen here, Stephen," Wahlberg began, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting ever could. "I came here to talk about my movie, not to be lectured by some privileged comedy writer who thinks he's better than everyone else because he went to fancy schools and never had to fight for anything in his life." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Colbert's carefully constructed television persona began to crack, revealing something uglier underneath. His fingers drummed against his desk with increasing intensity, and the trademark twinkle in his eye was replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Privileged?" Colbert's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That's rich coming from someone who made millions playing tough guys after spending his youth terrorizing innocent people. Tell me, Mark, when you're method acting, do you draw on those real-life experiences of violence?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep and expose old wounds. Wahlberg's face flushed red, and for a moment, it seemed like he might actually leap across the desk. The camera operators, sensing drama gold, zoomed in closer, capturing every micro-expression as the tension escalated beyond anything the show had ever broadcast. "You don't know what you're talking about," Wahlberg shot back, his voice rising despite his obvious efforts to maintain control. "You sit behind this desk every night, making jokes about people you've never met, judging situations you've never been in. You have no idea what it's like to grow up where I grew up, to make the mistakes I made, or to spend decades trying to make up for them." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, Wahlberg's emotional response seemed to fuel his aggression further. The host leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. "Oh, I see. So, we're supposed to feel sorry for you? The poor little rich movie star who had such a hard childhood that he felt justified in committing hate crimes?" Colbert's voice dripped with mock sympathy. That's quite the victim narrative you've constructed there, Mark. The use of the term hate crimes was the final straw. Wahlberg shot to his feet so quickly that his chair rolled backward, crashing into the backdrop with a sound that reverberated through the now silent studio. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and every muscle in his body seemed coiled for action. "That's enough!" Wahlberg roared, his voice echoing off the studio walls. "You want to talk about hate? Let's talk about the hate you're spewing right now, you self-righteous piece of—" "Gentlemen, please," came a voice from off-camera as a producer attempted to intervene, but both men ignored the plea entirely. They were locked in a battle of wills that had transcended mere television entertainment and become something far more primal and dangerous. The audience watched in stunned silence as America's sweetheart late-night host revealed a side of himself that few had ever seen. Gone was the affable comedian who made politics palatable with clever wordplay and theatrical expressions. In his place sat a man consumed with moral superiority, wielding his platform like a weapon against a guest who had clearly struck a nerve. As the confrontation reached this fever pitch, with both men glaring at each other across the desk like gladiators in an arena, it became clear that this was no longer about promotion or entertainment. This was personal, and whatever happened next would forever change how audiences viewed both men. The silence that followed Wahlberg's explosive outburst stretched for what felt like an eternity. Studio cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of the unprecedented meltdown unfolding before a live television audience. Colbert, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, attempted to regain control of the situation with a nervous laugh that sounded hollow and forced in the tense atmosphere. "Well, Mark, I can see we've touched a nerve," Colbert said, his voice wavering slightly as he tried to inject some levity back into the moment. But his attempt at damage control only served to pour gasoline on an already raging fire. "Touched a nerve?" Wahlberg's voice was incredulous, his eyes blazing with fury as he took a step closer to the desk. "You think this is funny? You think my life, my mistakes, my journey is some kind of punchline for your little comedy show?" The actor's hands were trembling now, whether from rage or adrenaline. It was impossible to tell. Behind the cameras, production assistants were frantically whispering into their headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this train wreck continue to unfold in real time. Colbert, sensing that his usual tactics weren't working, decided to escalate further rather than retreat. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic. "Look, Mark, if you can't handle a little criticism about your past, maybe you shouldn't have built your entire career on playing the tough guy. Maybe you should have stayed in Boston and kept doing whatever it is you were doing before Hollywood decided to rehabilitate your image." The words were calculated to wound, and they found their mark with devastating precision. Wahlberg's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and finally, cold fury. When he spoke again, his voice was eerily calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "You know what, Stephen? You want to talk about rehabilitation? Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about how you've spent your entire career hiding behind characters and jokes because you're too much of a coward to say what you really think. At least I own my mistakes. At least I've spent my life trying to make up for them. What have you done except sit in your ivory tower and judge everyone else?" The accusation hit Colbert like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely rattled. The careful composure he had maintained throughout his career began to crumble in real time. "Coward?" Colbert's voice rose to match Wahlberg's earlier volume. "I've been speaking truth to power my entire career. I've stood up to politicians, corporations, and yes, celebrities who think their fame makes them immune to accountability." "Accountability?" Wahlberg laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call this? This isn't accountability, Stephen. This is a public execution disguised as entertainment. You brought me on this show under false pretenses just so you could ambush me with the worst moments of my past. That's not journalism, that's just cruelty." The audience was completely silent now, too stunned to even applaud or gasp. Many were recording with their phones, capturing what would undoubtedly become the most viral late-night television moment in history. The tension in the studio was so thick it was almost suffocating. Colbert stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews. The move was clearly meant to assert dominance, but it only served to make the confrontation more intense. Cruelty? You want to know about cruelty? Cruelty is what you did to those innocent people when you were a teenager. Cruelty is building a career on charm and redemption, while never truly acknowledging the trauma you caused. I have acknowledged it, Wahlberg shot back, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. I've talked about it in interviews, I've made donations, I've tried to be better every single day of my life since then. But people like you will never let me move past it because it doesn't fit your narrative. You need me to be the villain because it makes you feel better about yourself. The psychological warfare between the two men had reached a new level. What started as a professional disagreement had devolved into something deeply personal, with each man attacking the very core of the other's identity. Colbert's next words would prove to be the point of no return. Maybe that's because you are the villain, Mark. Maybe some things are unforgivable, and maybe some people don't deserve redemption, no matter how many movies they make or how much money they donate to charity. The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath as Wahlberg processed what had just been said to him on live television. His face went through a series of micro-expressions before settling on something that could only be described as devastation mixed with rage. Unforgivable, Wahlberg repeated quietly, his voice barely audible. Unforgivable. When he looked up at Colbert again, there was something different in his eyes, a kind of hurt that went beyond anger into something much deeper and more dangerous. You know what's unforgivable, Stephen? Wahlberg's voice was gaining strength again, but now it carried a different quality, not just anger, but genuine pain. What's unforgivable is using your platform to destroy people for entertainment. What's unforgivable is pretending to be some moral authority while you tear down anyone who doesn't fit your perfect little worldview. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but Wahlberg held up a hand to stop him. No, you've said enough. You've shown everyone exactly who you really are tonight. Behind all that fake charm and those clever jokes, you're just another bully with a microphone. The word bully seemed to hit Colbert harder than any of the previous insults. His composure finally cracked completely, and what emerged was ugly and raw. Bully? I'm the bully? That's rich coming from someone who literally assaulted people because of their race. The audience gasped audibly at the bluntness of the statement. Several people in the front row were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and looking around as if searching for an exit. This had gone far beyond entertainment into something that felt genuinely dangerous. Wahlberg took another step toward the desk, his entire body radiating barely controlled fury. That's it. We're done here. This interview is over. But Colbert, apparently unable to stop himself from continuing to escalate, delivered one final devastating blow. Running away again, Mark? Just like you ran away from taking real responsibility for your actions? The accusation of cowardice was the final straw. Wahlberg's control finally snapped completely, and what happened next would become the most talked about moment in late-night television history. Coward? Wahlberg's voice exploded through the studio with such force that several audience members visibly flinched. Coward? His face was now completely red, veins bulging in his neck as 20 years of built-up frustration came pouring out in a torrent of raw emotion. You want to see a coward, Stephen? Look in the mirror. Without warning, Wahlberg slammed his fist down on Colbert's desk with such violence that the host's coffee mug jumped and spilled across his note cards. The sound reverberated through the studio like a gunshot, causing security guards stationed around the perimeter to take several steps forward, unsure whether they needed to intervene. I was a stupid, ignorant kid who made terrible mistakes. Wahlberg roared, his Boston accent now so thick it was almost unintelligible. But at least I had the guts to admit it, to face it, to spend every day of my adult life trying to be better. What's your excuse for being a piece of garbage right now, as a grown man on national television? Colbert, finally realizing he had unleashed something he couldn't control, attempted to backtrack. "Mark, please, let's just—" "No!" Wahlberg cut him off, with such ferocity that Colbert actually recoiled in his chair. "You don't get to let's just anything. You wanted this fight, you got it. You think you're some kind of moral authority? You think you're better than me? Let me tell you something about yourself, Stephen Colbert." The actor began pacing behind the guest chair like a caged animal, his movements sharp and aggressive. Every person in the studio was frozen, watching this unprecedented meltdown unfold in real time. Camera operators continued filming, knowing they were capturing television history, regardless of how uncomfortable it made everyone involved. "You hide behind comedy because you're terrified of being real for even 5 minutes," Wahlberg continued his assault. "You've built your entire career on being fake, on playing characters, on never having to stand for anything genuine because you can always claim it was just a joke. At least, when I was a screwed-up kid, I was being honest about who I was." The words hit Colbert like physical blows. His face had gone pale, and his hands were visibly shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. For perhaps the first time in his career, Stephen Colbert was completely speechless, unable to find a clever comeback or witty retort to deflect the brutal honesty being hurled at him. "And you know what the saddest part is?" Wahlberg's voice dropped to a more controlled level, but the intensity remained. "I actually used to respect you. I thought you were funny. I thought you were smart. But tonight, you've shown everyone exactly what you really are. You're a bully, hiding behind a desk and a smile, tearing people down because it makes you feel powerful." Colbert finally found his voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mark, I think we should take a commercial break." "Oh, now you want a commercial break?" Wahlberg laughed bitterly. "Where was that concern when you were publicly humiliating me for the entertainment of your audience?" "No, Stephen, we're going to finish this right here, right now, in front of everyone." The actor turned to face the audience directly, addressing them with an intensity that made many people uncomfortable. "You want to know the truth about your hero here? He invited me on this show tonight specifically to ambush me. His producers told my people this was going to be a light, fun interview about my new movie. Instead, he planned this whole attack from the beginning." Gasps rippled through the audience as Wahlberg revealed what was essentially a betrayal of the basic trust that exists between talk show hosts and their guests. Several people in the front row were now openly recording with their phones, sensing they were witnessing something that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. Colbert finally managed to stand up, his legs somewhat unsteady. That's not true. I would never." "Don't lie to them, Stephen!" Wahlberg cut him off again. "At least have the decency to admit what you did. You planned this ambush because you thought it would make good television. You thought you could destroy me for ratings and then go home feeling good about yourself because you held me accountable." The host's attempt to regain control was pathetic and transparent. "Mark, you're clearly upset, and I understand why, but—" "Upset?" Wahlberg's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Upset doesn't begin to cover it. I'm disgusted. I'm disgusted that I ever had any respect for you. I'm disgusted that you're allowed to have a platform to treat people this way. And I'm disgusted with myself for being naive enough to trust you." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning system seemed deafeningly loud. Production assistants were frantically trying to get direction from executives who were equally stunned by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a heated interview gone wrong. This was a complete, systematic destruction of a talk show host's reputation in real time. Wahlberg walked back toward the guest chair, but instead of sitting down, he picked up his jacket from where it had been draped over the back. The simple action sent a clear message to everyone in the studio. This interview was over, whether Colbert wanted it to be or not. "You know what, Stephen?" Wahlberg said, his voice now calm but filled with contempt. "I've spent 20 years proving to people that I've changed, that I've grown, that I'm not the same person I was as a teenager. But you? You just proved to everyone watching that you haven't changed at all. You're still the same insecure guy who needs to tear other people down to feel good about himself." Colbert made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mark, please, can we just talk about this like adults? I never meant for things to get so heated." The plea fell on deaf ears. Wahlberg looked at him with something approaching pity. Like adults? Stephen, adults don't ambush their guests on national television. Adults don't use their platform to publicly humiliate people for entertainment. Adults take responsibility for their actions instead of making excuses when they get called out. As Wahlberg put on his jacket, he delivered his final, devastating blow. You want to know the difference between you and me? I was 17 when I made my worst mistakes. You're a grown man making yours right now, in front of millions of people, and you still don't have the courage to admit what you've done. The actor turned toward the exit, but then paused and looked back at Colbert one last time. Good luck explaining this to your wife and kids when they watch it back. Good luck explaining to them why Daddy decided to be cruel to someone on television for fun. The mention of Colbert's family was the final humiliation. The host's face crumpled completely, all pretense of control abandoned. He slumped back into his chair, looking every bit like a man who had just realized he had destroyed his own reputation in pursuit of a cheap moment of television drama. Wahlberg walked toward the studio exit with measured, deliberate steps. As he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back to address the stunned audience one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when someone mistakes being clever for being decent. Learn from it. With that, Mark Wahlberg walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the night he decided to pick a fight with the wrong person. The audience sat in complete silence, processing what they had just witnessed, while Stephen Colbert remained slumped in his chair, finally understanding that some victories come at a price too high to pay. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Colbert's broken expression before finally cutting to an unscheduled commercial break that felt like a merciful end to the most uncomfortable 12 minutes in late-night television history.